Hello and welcome to this IEA briefing. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the head of media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Chris Snowdon, who is the head of lifestyle economics here at the IEA. Chris has today written a publication called Anti-Capitalism and Public Health. Chris, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure, as ever.
Could you tell me about this paper? What is it you're trying to achieve here?
Well, I've been reading a lot of the public health literature, even more than usual this year. And I came up with a paper a few months ago called The Corporate Playbook, which looks at the kind of public health analysis of policy making, which I think is kind of fatuous and simplistic and basically presents policy debates over so-called public health issues as being a binary war, really, between the forces of industry and the forces of public health. And it's not as simple as that. And even if it was as simple as that, it wouldn't really tell us very much that's useful, you know. And in this one, I dug a bit deeper and noticed that a lot of the public health literature from the last 10, 15 years, it's fairly recent stuff. It's not just about, big corporations are bad or so-called unhealthy commodity industries are bad. They've had to realize that if they're going to focus on the supplier and the manufacturer of so-called unhealthy commodity industries, it doesn't really matter if they're massive international corporations or just your local kebab shop. They're still the commercial determinants of health, as they put them. So logically enough, I guess, they've kind of expanded their remit. Instead of just attacking big tobacco, big alcohol, big food, they're now attacking what they call commercial entities, which could be anything that involves making a profit, making a product, or selling a product, let alone advertising it, even worse. And so it does follow from their analysis that you should be attacking any organization that sells tobacco or vapes or sugary food. But they've gone even further than that, really, and trying to undermine and basically overthrow just the existing economic order that allows these people to operate. So it's a kind of a series of logical steps, but they've wound up in a position, I say they, I mean some pretty major public health institutions, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, the World Health Organization had a big report about this last year, kind of pretty crazy stuff about pathological capitalism, word neoliberalism's always in there, always pejoratively. They don't really like free trade. They don't really like commercial activities. They haven't, it must be said, really come up with anything to replace all this stuff with. They mention a book called Doughnut Economics quite a lot, which is a bit of a Bible for the sort of eco-progressive left, in that the author, who used to be a researcher for Oxfam, isn't too keen on economic growth, to put it mildly.
And is the argument then that as the economy grows, or as a result of economic growth, people consume more and therefore they are more unhealthy?
Yeah, that's her main argument. She never gets into public health stuff. She never gets onto like obesity or smoking, anything like this. But this book seems to be quite popular with some people in public health. I have heard it mentioned by various people from like the Green Party and so on. But it seems to have caught on there. And again, the author of that book, Kate Raworth, doesn't have a lot to say about what's going to replace the existing order, but it should be replaced. But she is a bit more, she has got one or two firm policy preferences, which a lot of people in the public health literature don't. So the question is this just anti-capitalist rhetoric? I'm not, naive about this. I realize that a lot of academics are, at the very least, anti-capitalist, even if they wouldn't describe themselves as socialist or Marxist or communist or anything. It's very, very common in all sorts of academic fields to have a pop at neoliberalism. Fine, people obviously entitled to their own opinions. But the thing is, as Christian points out in the forward to this report, when people hear from the IEA, they know they're going to hear from people who believe in free market economics. It's kind of pretty much there on the tin. Whereas, are people really aware that public health these days increasingly is a militant political movement whose politics are pretty much irreconcilable with what any mainstream political party wants to achieve, in that they're against free trade? Most governments are trying to free up free trade. And they're against growth, and most governments, not least in Britain, are trying to get more growth. So the concern has to be, firstly, that these people are less interested in health than they may first appear, and actually just have some kind of fairly extreme political agenda instead. But even if that weren't the case, they would seem to me to be, at the very least, fairly sanguine about policies put forward in the name of public health which are going to damage growth because they don't like growth in the first place. And if they're going to damage business, fine, we don't like businesses either. So I think people who believe in free market economics need to be aware of what's going on in public health. As I say, it has been changing over the course of the last decade or two. It's much more political than it used to be, rather like the British Medical Association is now kind of a fairly hard left pressure group as much as anything. I think that's something that needs to be borne in mind.
So the fundamental problem here is that it's not that those particular academics have their own political persuasions, but that it isn't, what it says on the tin, that actually what is being sort of propagated as neutral scientific research is actually in reality coming from a very clear, staunch anti-capitalist perspective, and that is clearly being fielded in their work.
Yeah, which is fine if you are the Fabian Society, then people know that's where you're coming from. But these people present themselves as being public health experts, and it's evidence-based and it's science-led. And to what extent is that true? In fact, if what you really think is the problem with the world is not just capitalism, actually, just trade, just industry. A lot of the stuff I quote in the report are people who they haven't got some sort of Marxist critique of capitalism. They just think that somehow if they were in charge, the world would be very different. And in order to find out what that would look like, we need to rip down a lot of things that have actually been extremely good for the world and they don't really understand.
Yes, and they would rather us all be living in shacks, clearly, if they don't believe in growth. One part of your report that I found interesting that you highlighted was something by Professor Gerard Hastings, who used to be a World Health Organization advisor. And he claimed in 2020 that China's COVID-19 lockdown saved 77,000 lives, 20 times, and I quote, 20 times more than were taken by the virus, proving that switching off capitalism protects us from ourselves. So clearly, these kind of perspectives, and again, this is a former World Health Organization advisor, they are very much so explicitly anti-capitalist in what they're trying to say. And even if that doesn't necessarily fuel the rest of their research, the fact that they're coming from that perspective in their academic research, I think does tell us something about where they're coming from, especially when they end up promoting all of these kind of quite interventionist, quite authoritarian policies. Perhaps it comes from an anti-business perspective and not necessarily from a public health perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Gerard Hastings has been quite a significant figure actually in public health. And his main thing actually is marketing. He absolutely hates advertising. I think it's incredibly exploitative and manipulative and so on. And this is a very common thread through the public health literature. They massively exaggerate the importance of advertising in making people buy certain things and do certain things. And look, if it was just him and a few other people, you just go, well, fine, you get all sorts of people in academia. But it's not. And this WHO Europe paper that came out last summer, I mean, this not just anti-corporate, but anti-so-called neoliberalism narrative just went through it like a stick of rock in every chapter. And that's got the official imprint of the WHO on it. And again, European governments, I don't think are anti-trade and anti-industry, or even necessarily anti-alcohol or anti-food, But really, these people, I think, should be drawing the line at just being anti-alcohol and anti-tobacco and anti-junk food, if they want to be, rather than throwing the whole baby out the bathwater with of being anti-business. But
and why has this shift happened, do you think, or when do you think it started to happen?
It's been a gradual thing for a long time. Public health as a sort of institution has been changing for decades. Public health kind of originated in the 19th century as a way to get some sewers built and clean up the environment. And as infectious diseases declined and as the environment has got better, they've tended to shift towards individual lifestyle choices. That became more evident from the 1970s with the anti-smoking push and anti-alcohol push. But now they're getting into gambling as a public health issue. In the report, I mentioned some people who say that Deliveroo is a commercial determinant of health because people could use it to buy fatty food. Facebook is a commercial determinant of health because people, alcohol companies can advertise their beer on it. So very quickly you start thinking, well, what isn't a commercial determinant of health, right? And they would agree. They would go, yeah, everything is pretty much. Everything's either a social, economic, or a commercial determinant of health. And we as public health experts should tell the government what to do about it. Well, that's where it falls down, because even within their narrow field, when they stick to their knitting, these people can be mistaken, to put it mildly. If they're trying to sort out the entire, economic order of the planet, it's unlikely that someone who's done a year or two at university studying public health is going to be any better placed to speak to that than anyone else. So they're bitten off way more than they can chew. I think are sounding off about a lot of things that they don't really understand. And it seems to me that their political opinion has merged with their professional life to an excessive extent, and people should simply be wary of this. But when it happened, I would say about 15 years ago, when they started looking into there's a kind of sub-literature in public health about the so-called commercial determinants of health. That's a phrase that was only coined in around about 15 years ago. Then the whole corporate playbook theory is less than 15 years old. And they've just been building and building on it. But when I say building and building on it, I really miss being repeating themselves. They just keep saying the same things again and again, and then they reference this body of work and say, well, there we go, there's a consensus here in public health. But there's actually quite a small number of academics even writing about this.
And why are you worried about this?
Well, because public health has become very influential in policy. And politicians could just look at Britain in the last 20 years, see how many things, while the government hasn't been able to deal with a lot of serious problems, it's been able to deal with all sorts of stupid and trivial problems very ineffectively. Minimum pricing in Scotland and Wales, plain packaging of tobacco, all sorts of anti-smoking measures, the sugar tax. It goes on, and we've now got the generational tobacco ban. We've got all of the stuff on so-called junk food. Politicians seem to be very susceptible to campaigners who claim to be speaking in the name of public health. And so I think it's important that we look at who these people are and how robust is their evidence and what exactly is their worldview.
Chris, thank you very much for joining me today. If you are interested in reading Anti-Capitalism and Public Health, then do check out the IEA website at iea.org.uk and subscribe to insider.iea.org.uk. Thank you.